Hello, I'm Colin Sanders, and this is the next part of my extended review of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. We are at chapter 34, part 3, and the Romans are in a parlous state trying to deal with their formidable enemies, the Huns. The destruction of the Roman army meant that Constantinople was forced to use diplomatic methods, but diplomacy without force was a weak response against an enemy that held all the cards. There was in fact only one option open. The Byzantines plotted to assassinate Attila. The means was bribery. The agent was Edecon, a close associate of Attila's, who had seemed to be impressed by a visit to Constantinople. This was observed, and he was introduced to the eunuch Chrysippus, who had become the latest favourite to rule the emperor and through him the empire. Edecon was interested, and a deal was struck. But the plan called, obviously, for the presence of Attila. The only way this could be achieved was by a visit to the camp of the barbarian himself. A pretext was found and a delegation was sent, including the historian Priscus, whose day job was diplomacy. This had the added benefit, from our point of view, of getting us a really good account of the court of Attila. It would have been second nature for an experienced diplomat like Priscus to keep a careful note of everything that could prove to be useful in the future. What is more surprising is that the leader of the expedition, Maximin, wasn't in on the murder plot. This must have helped with security, but even so was quite a rotten trick to play on him. He took his son along with him. This wasn't necessarily the Roman equivalent of take your child to work day. It was a common diplomatic practice to lodge your children with the counterparty of a treaty as a guarantee of good behaviour. Aetius himself, the only Roman general to ever best Attila in battle, owed his knowledge of and good relations with the Huns to being brought up among them as a hostage. It was the custom to treat these hostages well, so it wasn't necessarily a bad thing to have on your CV. The journey to Attila's court was described in some detail by Priscus. They had some official Hun guides that accompanied them from inside the empire. It was a tough diplomatic mission from the get-go. At the first stop, at the city of Sardica, the two groups had a feast together, with the Romans acting as the hosts, given that they were still in imperial territory. Some hotheads on the Roman side got carried away during the toasts, pointing out that it was unfair to compare the human Attila with the god Theodosius. This wasn't, strictly speaking, in keeping with Christian theological position about monarchs. The Roman emperor was no longer divine himself. It also wasn't strictly very sensible to wind up the Huns at this point either. Maximin calmed things down and gave the barbarians some nice presents. The folly of boasting about the supposedly divine nature of the feeble occupant of the throne in Constantinople became apparent very quickly when they came to the city of Nisus. It was empty, all except for a handful of wounded people in some of the churches. It had obviously recently been raided by the Huns. Treaty or no treaty, the merely mortal Attila was able to sack the city of the empire at will. This was a world where a city could vanish without creating a stir, and even officials of the empire could be surprised to find that city depopulated. The party left the empire and entered Hun territory, where they found the natives to be surprisingly friendly and helpful. The most helpful was the widow of Attila's recently deceased brother, who laid on a sumptuous feast and also threw in the use of a gaggle of attractive young women. The account doesn't detail what they did with them. They also found themselves subjected to mind games by the artful Attila as they got closer to Attila's camp. They were insulted by frequent changes to their itinerary. Attila revealed that he already knew a lot more about what was going on at court than he should have done. The source of his information was never revealed. As they neared their destination, he asked if the party had any more to say, and if not, the meeting was cancelled. Maximin was understandably furious that Attila knew as much about his mission as he himself did. He was obliged to pitch his tent on low ground so they didn't block Attila's view. After all this, Attila continued to pile on the humiliations once the mission had finally got to meet him. He pointed out that the Romans were lying about some prisoners he wanted returned, and indulged in the kind of epic insults that only total military supremacy makes possible, pointing out that he could level any city he chose to the ground. He laid on a feast, but gave pride of place to one of his barbarian allies. The representative of the Emperor of the Romans was relegated to the second rank. But he mellowed a bit by the third and final day of the mission and accepted some lucrative presents, and in return gave the ambassadors some horses, a very Hun kind of a gift. Maximin must have been happy to leave, having at least achieved something in very difficult circumstances with a very tough customer, which was when the plot to kill Attila was revealed. Edecon had repented and freely confessed his part in the plot. The interpreter, Vigilius, who was carrying the cash to pay the assassin, was seized and his purse taken. Attila would have been quite justified in killing him, but he simply reconfigured the bribe as a ransom. He decided to hold the eunuch Chrysippus, who was after all the prime mover behind the plot, responsible, and demanded either his head or a huge ransom in compensation. The money that had to be paid to save the neck of this court favourite would have paid for a war, and that would no doubt have been money better spent. The mission was about as complete a failure as any in history. Far from removing the threat, it had in fact weakened the position of the empire still further. But it did give us the great advantage of a first-hand account of Attila and his society. His appearance was, according to Gibbon's translation, a large head, a swarthy complexion, small, deep-seated eyes, a flat nose, a few hairs in the place of a beard, broad shoulders, and a short, squat body of nervous strength, though of a disproportioned form. This suggests an Asiatic appearance, as would be expected from Gibbon's interpretation of the Huns' origin on the borders of China. His behaviour was imperious, taking delight in the power he exerted over his followers, but he didn't feel the need to dress the part. His clothes were plain and reflected his pastoral origins. Apart from the bathhouse mentioned earlier, he didn't trouble with a splendid palace either, settling for a simple tent like his ancestors. I think it's fair to say that by our standard, Hun society was a male-dominated one, but the Romans were surprised at how big a role women played, particularly the way they greeted the important guests, even hugging them. Priscus also had a very interesting experience with a man he met. A barbarian approached him and struck up a conversation in perfect Greek. The man had been captured and enslaved by the Huns. This didn't turn out as bad as it might have done. His master was a reasonable man and allowed him to fight on Hun raids and to keep his share of the spoil. He had used the proceeds to buy his freedom and became a Hun warrior in his own right. He outspokenly claimed that being captured was a blessing and that the life he now lived was one of freedom and contentment compared to the one he left behind. He was contemptuous of Roman leaders who could not protect their citizens and yet denied them the weapons to defend themselves. This was bad enough, but they also charged outrageous taxes. Justice was perverted to defend the interests of the rich at the expense of the poor. Priscus did his best to defend the regime he was representing and managed to partially win the apostate round. He ended by blaming the shortcomings of the empire on the corruption of the officials who had undermined the wise institutions they had inherited to protect the elite and oppress the public. It was an interesting commentary on what was actually going on at the time. Another insight into the situation was the case of Azimuntium. While the Huns were able to ransack most of the empire at will, they came up against an obstacle in the form of the otherwise obscure city somewhere in the Black Sea region. We still don't know exactly where it was. They put up not only an effective defence, but quite a proactive one. They sent out sorties to seize groups of Huns to hold as hostages and made their area one that the Huns avoided. Attila tried to get their submission via threats to Constantinople, but the officials had to concede that they had no control over their nominal subjects. We don't know what exactly was going on in Azimuntium. We aren't even exactly sure where it was. Maybe there was some peculiarity of its geography that made it a tough target for the cavalry-based Huns, but it seems more likely that some local initiative was undertaken to illegally arm the population and to adopt effective countermeasures. The interesting thing is to ponder how successful the Huns would have been had every city shown as much resolution. The journey back to Constantinople must have been a miserable one. They had failed about every way it was possible. They hadn't made peace with the Huns, they'd alienated them. In fact, they were lucky to escape with their lives. How much longer the hapless Theodosius would be able to keep his throne was very much in the hands of the man that they had just mightily pissed off with a pathetic failure of an assassination attempt. It seemed like only a matter of time before the empire was put out of its misery. In fact, Theodosius was soon to leave the throne, but not in the conflagration that Attila was bound soon to inflict on him. The unwarlike prince died fittingly in an accident. He fell from his horse and died of his wounds. It was a suitably undramatic end to a reign that was little more than presiding over a succession of worthless favourites. It was only the even worse performance of his contemporaries that saves his memory from complete contempt. There was only one remaining member of the direct descendants of the great Theodosius left, the sister of the recently dead and distinctly ungreat Theodosius, Pulcheria. Pulcheria had already exerted an unprecedented level of influence for a woman. She was now to go one step further. She became the first official empress in Roman history to rule in her own name. Pulcheria was, however, the pragmatist's pragmatist. Unlike her brother, she was well aware of the way the world worked, and quickly and deftly chose a partner to share the burden of running the empire. Her choice fell on an oldish but very sensible man by the name of Marcian. The empire was, for the first time in many years, in the hands of grown-ups who knew what they were doing. This was all to the good, but for now the man making the running was still Attila. Thanks for listening to this episode, and next time we'll get to see what Attila was like when he really got mad. In the meantime, thanks for listening.